It's no surprise, is it? Austerity, poverty, mass unemployment equals let's start kicking migrants. Let's start attacking migrants. I mean, so for somebody who's been around for a while, I mean, there's a pattern to all this. And it's tremendous to see so many people in this meeting because it's a matter that we have to take up with the utmost urgency. And, you know, I mean, as I say, it's no surprise, but the depths to which they go. And I want to do something now because, of course, the latest little wheeze from Theresa May is that you need to know the first verse of the national anthem. So I'm going to ask here, how many people know how many verses there is of the national anthem in this room? No. Well, because Margaret's on the platform here, I'm not going to sing this, but I'll say in a sort of singing voice, the sixth verse of the national anthem, which I think should be compulsory to bring migrants into the culture of Great Britain. It goes like this. Lord, grant that Marshal Wade may by thy mighty aid victory bring. May he sedition hush, and like a torrent rush, rebellious Scots to crush, God save the Queen. Oh, yeah. What a marvellous culture Britain has, eh? You know, welcome to Britain, as long as you're not Scottish. I'd like to see him sing that in the streets of Glasgow. But it's as I say, it's not a mistake. It's a conscious thing, I think, which is now beginning to emerge. Suddenly, more and more stories in the papers, and of course, oddly enough, it was, of course, David Miliband who kicked it off with his apology for all the terrible things that Labour had done. I mean, I can't quite know. I can't. You know, picture in my head what they did for migrants, other than lock them up and, give them vouchers and ostracise them when they came to this country. But apparently that was all a big mistake, so he tells us. And he's in the paper as quoted as saying that we shouldn't regard, he said, the headline is, don't call worried people bigoted, he said. And he was particularly referring to one Gillian Duffy. People might remember at the last general election, she was the bigot who went on about refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants overrunning our town, etc. And quite rightly, Gordon Brown got in his car and said, who introduced me to that bigot? And he was picked up, and it was a bit... You'll be surprised to know that Gillian Duffy is in fact a member of the Labour Party. And this is what she had to say. She said, up here there's no work, and people get resentful when they see them going to work and they apply for lots of jobs and do not get anywhere. You know, solidarity from the Labour Party. But the reality is those types of ideas get reinforced and strengthened with each successive attack upon migrants, upon refugees, etc. And it's absolutely important that we don't give 1 inch. We're not David Miliband, we're not the Labour Party, we are people who understand that actually giving an inch to the racists, giving an inch at all, actually gives these people courage to go further. There is no amount of immigration controls that these racists want, restrictions, they want black people out full stop. So every time you give a concession to them, they want more. That's the first thing. But I want to give a little bit of an historical overview, really, and we'll start with this. Human beings, here's one for David Miliband, have always moved around the world. Have always. Since the first human beings came out of Africa and started to expand across the globe, hence we are all at root African migrants, human beings have looked for a better life. Of course they have. We've all done, all generations have done it, and in particular the British. I mean, you know, it always makes me laugh when these people go on about, you know, migrants in Britain. It's funny, isn't it? You come to Britain looking for work, looking for a better life, and you're an immigrant. You go abroad to Spain and you're an expat. Yeah. I mean, it's a funny type of approach there. And of course, the fact is that for the majority of the time that human beings have been on the planet, there have been no borders. There were no restrictions. People moved wherever they could go in order to survive. And since people were tied to the land, by and large, it restricted where people moved. But of course, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, migration of people, if you can call it that, that we've seen in the last 500 years was what? The slave trade, where human beings in their millions were taken against their will in chains as animals and shipped across the globe to work for profit until they died. There was no immigration controls then for slaves. There's no requirement for passports for those people. They were simply a commodity to be used in the interests of the ruling class of profit. And of course, the profits that the slave trade, created helped generate and fuel the Industrial Revolution in Britain. And that in turn saw a huge migration of people. First of all, people from the land. And of course, in order to get people to work in the factories, what do the bosses do? They introduced the Enclosures Act. They basically took common land off people, forced them into the towns to work. And when there wasn't enough of them, what did they then do? They then decided to look elsewhere. And where did they look first of all? They looked to Ireland. And of course, there were a combination of famine and inducements. Irish workers came across the Irish Sea to work in Britain and work as migrant workers. And what we saw with the influx of Irish workers, the number of Irish workers in Britain doubled in the 1840 to some 800,000. We saw a pattern emerge of how immigrant workers, migrant workers, are both used and castigated at the same time by the system. Because of course the Irish workers came across, they had the worst living conditions, they had the worst jobs, the worst housing. They were used by the bosses in that respect, but at the same time they were then abused. There were cases where groups of where Irish workers were brought across to break strikes, but at the same time there was then a huge increase in official anti-Irish racism. Why? To serve the purposes of the bosses to divide and rule. And Marx saw it, and I'll give you this quote. This is what Karl Marx wrote in 1870. He says, and most important of all, every industrial and commercial centre in England now possesses a working class divided into two hostile camps, English proletarians and Irish proletarians. The ordinary English worker hates the Irish worker as a competitor who lowers his standard of life. In relation to the Irish worker, he feels himself a member of the ruling nation and so turns himself into a tool of the aristocrats and capitalists of his country against Ireland, thus strengthening their domination over himself. And he went on to say this: this antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all means at the disposal of the ruling classes. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class, despite its organisation. It is the secret by which the capitalist class maintain its power, and that class is fully aware of it. Now, Marx's words could be applied today absolutely in terms of how the issue of migrants and immigrant workers is addressed in this country. Now, it wasn't until 1905 that the first immigration laws were passed in this country. It was called the Aliens Act. No ambiguities in that one. And it was aimed specifically at Jewish workers fleeing pogroms and oppression in Eastern Europe. And it came at a time when British capitalism, up to that point which had been absolutely dominant, was facing a major threat. It was in relative decline, and there was a growing level of unemployment and poverty in Britain, and that obviously the ruling class wanted quite specifically to blame somebody. Somebody had to be responsible for it, and it became the Jews. And again, I'll give you a quote. This is from a Liberal MP. He said this. This is a guy called Cathcart Wilson. What is the use of spending thousands of pounds on building beautiful workmen's dwellings if the places of our own people, the backbone of the country, are to be taken over by the refuse scum of other nations? You know, welcome to Britain. That's how it was framed. And the laws were quite specifically directed against Jews, stopping people coming in. It led to the growth of anti-Semitism, it led to the growth of Britain's first sort of quasi-fascist organisation, the British Brothers League, which specifically targeted Jewish migrants. And unfortunately, that racism affected the official trade union and workers' movements. The TUC, for example, from 1892 onwards, campaigned openly for the banning of all immigration. They passed resolution after resolution demanding an end to immigration, which actually shows you how far we've come since those days, although obviously nobody's told Ed Miliband. And you even had the spectacle of Ben Tillett, who was a militant, the leader of the Dockers Union. He told a group of migrant workers this. He said, "Yes, you are our brothers, and we will do our duty by you, but we wish you had not come." Those were his words to these workers, these Jewish workers who came incidentally and brought with them the terrible, socialist traditions and trade union traditions, which they then built and then created and added to the stock of the British working class movement. Now, throughout the 1920s and 1930s, immigration into Britain was almost at a level of zero, for a simple reason: there were no jobs. I mean, you would have to be off your head, for example, to decide to, come to Britain and say, "Oh, I know, I'll tell you what I'll do. It's 1936, I think I'll go find a job in Jarrah, where there's 70% unemployment." I mean, nobody travelled because there were no jobs. But after the end of the Second World War, after the carnage of the war, there was an acute labour shortage. There was an economic boom and a labour shortage. And suddenly, Britain needed workers. And where did they look to those workers? They looked to what used to be called the Empire, now suddenly becomes the Commonwealth, much a cuddlier name, and people were encouraged to come, first from the West Indies, then from the Indian subcontinent. My dad was one of them. He arrived in Britain with a British passport. I remember him saying to me, "I had this British passport and I always thought I was British until I came to Britain, then I discovered I wasn't British at all." And workers were encouraged. Enoch Powell, the notorious racist, the man who went on about rivers of blood, he actually went to the West Indies to recruit nurses to come across to work in the NHS. And workers came, and they came to do the jobs that were available. They came to do jobs that other people wouldn't do. The NHS, for example, was built by migrant workers. Right? We should always remember that. Now,
still is.
Absolutely still is. And the point is that we have a situation where when there is a need, workers move. There is no restrictions, no limitations. People are encouraged to come. However, there was also a level of racism directed against those workers as well, because it's well worthwhile for the bosses to ensure that they have both sides of the, that they've got all their sides covered. So, of course, as we know, whilst workers were encouraged to come, they were put in the worst housing. They got the worst jobs, the worst wages. People talk about the stories, and they are true, that people used to walk around the streets and there used to be guest houses and boarding houses with signs up saying "No blacks, no Irish, no dogs." And that's how people were greeted. But still, people came, and they came to work. They came to contribute to society. Now, as the British economy began to slow down even further, they in 1962 passed the first, the first post-war legislation, the Commonwealth Immigrations Bill, which was aimed specifically at workers. It introduced work vouchers, and it was aimed especially at keeping the unskilled workers out. Now, I've got not very long, so I'll just try to speed up really a little bit. Throughout the 1960s and the 1970s, and to this day, there's been successive laws to restrict the number of workers coming in. All of them, as I say, have been aimed at workers. In 1968 there was a law passed, in 1971. These were overtly racist, and the effect of those laws was to equate immigration with black people. That was one of the effects that they had. And Labour's response was quite shameful. This is Richard Crossman, a senior Labour figure, saying this: "Ever since the Smethwick election, it has been quite clear that immigration can be the greatest potential vote loser for the Labour Party. If we are seen to be permitting a flood of immigrants to come in and blight the central areas of our cities," that is the words of a Labour politician. And that's how immigration has been seen ever since. It's been seen as a means, on the one hand, by the bosses to give themselves cheap labour, cheap in the sense of not undercutting workers' wages, but cheap in the sense that we can get you cheap, we'll get you cheap. I mean, that's what they're about, cutting our wages. It's also been a means by which they can divide workers. Now, just very quickly, I'll say this. You see, I'll come on at the end, and I'm sure it'll be come out in the discussion. We have to tackle the argument that immigration causes unemployment. It simply does not. The highest levels of immigration into Britain came at a time of the lowest levels of unemployment. Workers, by and large, don't move around if there isn't jobs available for them. And what they certainly do is they don't move into areas and say, "I'll have your job." I mean, I live in Newcastle. The coalfields in Newcastle and the North East were not emptied because of migrants. The collieries and the pits weren't shut because of immigrant workers. The areas where there's the highest levels of unemployment, incidentally, places like Tyneside, Glasgow, etc., are the areas with the lowest levels of immigrants, of refugees, of migrants, etc. And again, we have to take that argument on. Perhaps we can do it in the course of the discussions. I mean, the solution, incidentally, when people go on about migrants undermining people's wages, is this: fight for the same rate for every worker. We don't blame somebody coming in who's been undercut, who's been underpaid by a boss. We say it's the boss to blame. Now, I've been asked to finish, and I'll just finish by saying this. You see, we have a different approach to Ben Tillett when it comes to migrant workers. We don't say what he said. We'll do our duty by you, but we wish you hadn't come. What we say is this. What the Socialist Workers' Party says is this. We say, you are our brothers and our sisters. You are victims of the same system that we are. You are not the problem, you're part of the solution. Every single one of you is welcome here.
Yeah, after the overview of immigration for the last century and a half, I was going to start saying, where are we right now? And we have one of the longest running financial crises, very, very deep financial crises, austerity, biting deep, making the working class pay across the world, across Europe, and an increased polarisation across Britain and Europe, and in terms of both politics generally and voting. If you look at France, Marine Le Pen got the biggest vote ever for a fascist. Her niece got elected, while 40% of people don't vote actually in those elections. In Greece, you have Golden Dawn, street fascist thugs, quite literally street thugs. And you have also Berlusconi has had the far right in power with him until he got flung out himself there recently. And what has happened through all that period, and in Britain as well as Europe, is mainstream politicians and the press have pandered to the far right. And they have scapegoated. They've scapegoated Muslims, Roma, migrants and refugees. Major roundups in Italy, Spain and France of these people to be deported. Huge violent attacks against them as well. The Italian Navy sitting by and letting ships of migrants sink while people die rather than let them land. Cameron, Sarkozy have both made huge numbers of speeches, particularly Islamophobic speeches. Sarkozy is now out, but Cameron is going on. But worst of all, Blue Labour, as Yunus was saying. Glassman, John Cruddas, Ed Miliband. And all of them stealing the clothes of the far right. They will divide people, blame immigrants for cuts and unemployment. They don't build any houses, you can't get a house, it's the refugees to blame. They cut Frontline services in the NHS, your granny can't get a bed, it's the refugees to blame. There's no jobs, it's the refugees to blame, or the migrants to blame. But it started under Blair, actually. Jack Straw, and I put my hand up here, I never expected much from Labour. But when Anne Widdecombe said the lovely town of Dover is being ruined by refugees, I did expect Jack Straw to tell her to shut up. No, he says, you're absolutely right. In fact, the whole southeast of England is. We need to disperse them all over the place. We need to discourage them from coming, but we're going to disperse them anyway. Internal dispersal is absolutely unheard of as a tradition in Britain. It belongs to Tsarist and Stalinist Russia. But people were internally dispersed. And if you think to it, when they try something, when they want to do something, they start with the most vulnerable. Because the refugees were dispersed. Who's going to be dispersed now? The poor of London are going to be dispersed now because of the benefit cuts in housing. So the next set of people to be internally dispersed in Britain is going to be the poor of London. And then it'll be the poor of all sorts of other places. That is the way these things work. So you get this to the point that I don't know what people actually know about how refugees live. They arrive, they get dispersed, they're told where to live, they daren't move, they sign on once a week. They're subject almost immediately to arrest. They can be down-rated with arrest. If their case fails, then they can be evicted, destitution and possibly deportation. Their case is dealt with as a legal thing in a climate of disbelief, like a criminal case almost, and it is the blunt, most horrendous form of institutionalised state racism. And that is what happened up in Glasgow. People came, they arrived, the campaign met in small numbers in pubs to start with, deciding we want to welcome these people and try and help them. And Dungaville Detention Centre got built. We went out there, detention camp really, to try and stop it. And meetings got bigger, the demos got bigger. The I family spent 13 months in detention. They recently got a sum of money, three-figure sum of money to sort of compensate for their childhood being ruined in Britain. But that triggered off a demonstration run by the STUC where 1,200 people, trade union-backed demonstration, biggest ever outside a detention centre in Britain, happened in conjunction with the campaign to welcome refugees. Following that, the G8 demo, 2,000 people outside detention centre, trade union-backed, but the dawn raids increased. Kicking the doors in at 5 o'clock in the morning, dragging families out, handcuffing them, screaming children and taken away for deportation. And the demos got bigger. In the working class areas, the poor of Glasgow, where people had been housed, the demos got bigger. Hundreds of people turning out, turning back the vans. Every weekend at the Home Office, 400 or 500 people. We were intimidating them. They complained to their union. We were intimidating them. The people that were dragging the families out, we women like me were intimidating them, you know. And that was how it started to go till we had 1,000 people walking through the streets of Glasgow. And finally, the dawn raids stopped in Scotland. And finally, the immigration minister stopped coming as well because they were terrified, actually. No-go area for immigration ministers. But increasing numbers of single people destitute. And finally, a tragedy. Three people, a family and adults, threw themselves from the 18th floor of the charity building of the YMCA. And everybody was, as you can imagine, utterly gutted. And within 5 days, 1,000 people marched again through the city to say this is not acceptable, this is not tolerable. Worse to come because the contracts have been renegotiated. Now the housing contracts are with Serco, Reliance and G4S. Three major multinational companies which actually have dreadful human rights issues. Jimmy Mabenga, murdered by G4S. Serco allowed a man to die in Colnbrook recently. Reliance beat up Jemima, that was in socialist worker, just 3 weeks ago at point of deportation. And we keep saying this is not going to be allowed to go on. We will not allow these evictions. We will not have people in the streets because why now want us to evict 100 people in the turnover to this multinational company Serco? And we are saying they will not be evicted, you will not be dragging people out of their houses, and you will not be indefinitely detaining people under asylum and immigration for as long as 6 years. This is not going to happen. People are going to fight this. And we're going to fight it with the unions and with everyone else who wants to fight it. 3 weeks ago, a national demonstration in Glasgow, 1,000 people, backed by the STUC, called by our campaign, backed by the STUC, the Catholic Church, the Church of Scotland, NGOs, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of ordinary working class people. We were applauded going round the streets of Glasgow. The police said, this demonstration is going to the wrong place, it's going to interrupt everybody's Saturday. They applauded us as we walked round that street, these streets, to say, refugees are welcome here. In 6 weeks we raised £2,500 to finance the demo. 600 of it from a wee school that we went to speak at, where they had a fundraiser for us. They spent £1 not to wear their uniform and 50p to fling sponges at teachers, and they raised it. Yeah, I'm not sure about whether they enjoyed that more than the commitment to the cause, but £600 these Waynes actually made for us. So that is how we are mobilising. And we have been mobilising that way for years. A united front campaign that crosses all the politicians that want to support you, the trade unions, the NGOs, all the ordinary people that want to support you. And we've started to sort of move into England as well, because this won't be won in Scotland. This has to be won in the streets of Manchester, Birmingham, Newcastle, London as well. And that's why we're working with RAPAR over this. Why Birmingham people came up to the demo, Manchester people came up to the demo, I think Sheffield people came up to the demo. People travel from all over England to that demonstration. And what we're saying now is, you can also link this in with the cuts and with privatisation. Serco, G4S, what else do you think they do? They have multi-billion-pound contracts with councils for roads, for housing, for the NHS, and they bungle all of them, by the way, and they lose money and mess up everywhere. And yet, that's these companies. The privatisation that is hurting all our services, all our jobs, is also hurting the refugees. And this is where we can pull all the campaigns together about unemployment, cuts, privatisation, and dealing with the way refugees are treated in this country. You can pull all of that together. Ed Miliband actually did say one thing that was right, but not for the right reasons. It is a class issue. This is a class issue. Not because the working class suffer for having migrants here. That is rubbish. It is a class issue because we are all together being screwed by the system. It's a class issue because Theresa May, amongst other things, will facilitate business people coming to this country. If you have £1 million to spend, you go quicker into getting status and quicker into being a citizen. If you have £2 million you bring into this country, you go quicker still. If you get asylum and you want to bring some of your family over that were split up from you, I mean, people end up split up from their 10-year-old kids as they run in the course of a massacre in a village. If you want to bring your family over, you can't if you haven't got a job and you've got no money. You can't unless you're earning a very specific sum of money, which is what not very many people are getting given by their bosses. If you're poor, you can't bring your family in. This is the Tory government that cares for families. But if you're rich, you will actually be sold British citizenship effectively. And of course, once you're a citizen, you promptly move all your money to a tax exile fund anyway, but there it is. That is the way. It's blatant, absolutely blatant that it's a class issue. Of course, we all stand together, wherever we come from, whatever our colour of skin, whatever culture, whatever religion, we are all across the world being screwed by the same system. And we all want the same things. A decent house, a decent education for our kids, just a decent, ordinary future life for ourselves, all of us, no matter where we come from. But that is being denied us, and that has been denied us by the system, it has been denied us by the Tories, and it has been denied us, actually, by the Labour Party. Ed Miliband's speech is utterly scurrilous, absolutely scurrilous. As Yunus says, you know, if you, but thousands of jobs disappeared in Glasgow over Christmas, actually, and thousands more between then and now. What, did the refugees get the jobs? No, the bosses just scrapped the jobs and the jobs went. Actually, loads and loads of hospital wards have been shut down. What, are the refugees in the hospital beds? No, the hospital beds are gone. Are the refugees getting the jobs in the hospital? No, because those jobs are gone. They did not cause those jobs to go or those services to go. They're not taking the jobs, they're not taking the services. Glasgow City Council privatised the house and haven't built a house for years. If you can't get a house, what are the refugees sitting in these bijou houses that they fled from Africa to come to this little bijou flat in Springburn? I can tell you that, no, they're sitting in slum housing the same as a good number of other people. They are not taking the houses. That is just the way it is put to us, and we mustn't fall for that. That is their solution. That is their solution to all of this. We pay for the crisis, we blame each other, we fight amongst ourselves, and we particularly blame black people, we blame migrants, we blame people who are coming here to seek asylum from the bombs that they are dropping on these folk, and we blame all of these people, and we fail to organise, and that just leaves us all open. Well, that isn't going to happen. That is not going to happen. We are not going to allow people to be treated that way in the first place, dumped on the streets, arrested, brutally treated, beaten up and then deported back to hellholes. We're not going to allow that to start with, and we are not going to allow ourselves to be divided. Our solution is a different solution. Our solution is that the working class is an international class that stands together, and our solution is we fight together, we kick out this bloody, vicious, racist, irrational, totally irrational, nasty system. We say we are not having any more of that. Work, you do the work. We've all been doing the work. You can't do without us. There's millions of us. There's not so very many of these people. The 1% is actually quite small. The people that do all the work are all of us across the world. They can't manage without us. Wherever we come from, whatever our colour of skin, they need us. We do not need them. And we do not need the racism, and we do not need the viciousness and the violence. We stand together, we fight together, and we beat them, we win, and we have a better life for the rest of the world, everyone across the world, and we get rid of these bastards, actually. And if Ed Miliband doesn't like that, well, he needs to start reading different books and singing a very different song, not the national anthem, but he needs to start singing a different song, because where he comes from, he is not going to fight. We are the ones that have got to fight.
Betty Moran from Manchester, member of the SWP. Yunus talked about the anti-Irish racism, the historical basis of the anti-Irish racism. And one of the things that is important, I think, for us to recognise is that the eviction into destitution that's now been going on in relation to people seeking asylum since 2002. And remember when it was reintroduced into the British state that it became legal to evict people into destitution in 2002. It was first directed towards Afghan men and Iraqi men. So while they were loading up the bombs to start bombing Baghdad, they were putting letters, envelopes through doors of Iraqi and Afghan refugees in the UK, telling them your asylum claim's been failed, get out. And these people ended out on the street. But the last time the British state encoded in law a legitimate act to make it legitimate, it's legal to evict people into destitution, was the Poor Law Amendment Act that was applied to the Irish during the famine. And when you look at the cabinet papers that underpinned that, the British state, the ruling class of Britain, sat down in a room in Westminster and decided it was going to be legitimate to evict people into destitution onto the street, and if they wanted to eat that day, they must work. And if you were a nursing mother, you must be on that street and you must work. And they actually went so far as to encode in writing that the work in and of itself must be useless. And that is why there's lots of little roads in Ireland that lead nowhere. Do not underestimate the psychology that is operating on the part of the state. They are absolutely ruthless. And the psychology is designed to foster and entrench a level of dependency upon the most vulnerable. Why aren't you allowed to work if you're a person seeking asylum? Well, one of the basic reasons you're not allowed to work is they don't want you stood beside me who is allowed to work because I've got a British passport and I've got an Irish passport, but I am allowed to work here. They don't want you stood beside me talking to me about your life, because they rely on the British people not knowing about what the reality is of the person seeking asylum. And if you're not a mother or a father at a school gate, where do you go? Where is the collective space that you go to talk to people who are not like you? So do not underestimate the psychology. The only other thing I wanted to raise was about this. There's so much to talk about, isn't there? But at the end of the day, they have been indefinitely detaining people for years in this country. We know about some of the high-profile cases involving Muslim people. This is what they have been doing to people seeking asylum for a number of years. They can do it to them, they can do it to the rest of us. We're one step away from it. We have nothing to lose but our chains.
Hi, my name's Mitch. I'm from Cambridge branch, SWP. I live fairly near a town, or city rather, called Peterborough. Now, I don't know if anybody knows, but the Fenland area there's a lot of farming, a lot of fruit, vegetable growing, and a lot of Eastern Europeans have come over in the last few years and been working there. Now, the farmers, some of them are all right, but most of them are real horrible Tory bastards. And as such, they lay off people at will. It was discovered that migrants who have been laid off from their jobs are living in cardboard cities in the parks in Peterborough. The BBC News, rather than saying how bad this was, were going around with the police, who have been, there's a police team that's been specially selected and made to find these people. As I say, the BBC News were going around with them saying, this is terrible, these people ought to be sent back, there's nothing we can do, we've got to send them back. And it was shocking. It was giving totally the wrong impression of people who are so bloody skinned and they have to live in a park underneath cardboard. It was just disgusting. Just a couple of other quick points regarding Ed Miliband. I think it's a bit rich, considering he's the son of an immigrant who came here to escape Nazi persecution. Ralph Miliband actually was quite a Marxist, and I think the spinning noise you heard was him turning in his grave whilst he was speaking. And the other thing is just to be aware, the EDL, who are the direct descendants of the British Brothers League, are marching in Bristol next week. And there's going to be quite a big turnout to let them know they're not really welcome. So rather than saying migrants are not welcome, let's just say the EDL is not welcome.
Hi, I'm Mona. I'm originally from Germany, so I'm practically a migrant as well. Obviously, I haven't really felt it much because I have a European passport, which is very useful. And until recently, actually, it felt that if you have a European passport, it's very convenient. You can go around in all of Europe, and most of the time they don't even ask you for your passport if you even cross a border. But this kind of illusion of freedom of movement, as they called it, you had in the European Union freedom of capital and freedom of movement, because a European passport made it easier to cross borders. This kind of illusion has been over pretty recently. It has become quite clear, actually, that this is only about freedom for capital. There's nothing for us ordinary people in it. And you can see it now that the Schengen Agreement, which is the law about this freedom of, that people can travel freely, has been restricted for Greek and Spanish people trying to get to Northern Europe. And pretty easily, without even asking any national parliament, without even asking the European Parliament, they just said, that's it. Greek people, for them we're going to make it harder to come to Europe. And that's how easy they just get rid of all these rights that we supposedly have. Another thing I wanted to say, I've been mainly politically active in the Netherlands, and as you might know, there is a really, really violent racist politician, very influential there, Geert Wilders, was making a lot of Islamophobic remarks. The best way actually to fight against him, the only time when he had to shut up literally, was when the cleaners started to organize. And the cleaners were mainly, a lot of them were Muslim women wearing a hijab, a headscarf. And they were leading the strikes. Their symbol was like a cleaner's glove, and with a fist. It was like clean enough was the slogan. And it's really nice because they have been so powerful and so inspiring. Like I think a year ago, on International Women's Day, the demonstration was led by women wearing a headscarf. And that's basically really a fist to all those fascists who like claim that women with a headscarf can't be emancipated. And that's the way we have to organize. I think I wouldn't have known about these strikes if I wouldn't have been in an organization that had linked these struggles together and to help to connect with women wearing a hijab. And I think that's a really important message to all of us, for people here in the room. If you want to get involved and you want to fight against racism, Islamophobia, then please join the SWP and get involved. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Joe. I'm from Liverpool Hope University. I actually just wanted to talk really quickly about what we might term as the so-called successful migrants. What I mean by that is migrants who are actually got visas and are allowed to work in the UK. And basically what I wanted to say is the last two governments for the last 15 years have basically created a system of indentured labour in this country, something which we thought maybe ended actually during the imperial years. But my experience is really from working in the care industry, and in that industry I saw workers who were forced to, were often told lies by agencies in, say, the Philippines or India about the kind of jobs and the kind of opportunities they'd have when they come to the UK. When they got here, none of those opportunities came true. They would be stuck on minimum wage for a matter of years. They were often tied into contracts either with specific employers or more normally into specific sectors, so they might be tied to specifically the care industry, which, as I'm sure most of you know, is actually one of the most devalued and low-paid industries out there. And other sort of more informal processes, which I also blame the UK state for, which is, I'll give you one example of a woman I knew while I worked in this care home, who basically, she was actually allowed to work in the UK, and I think she's actually had British citizenship, but she was not able to take some of her family over from Kenya. So what this meant essentially was that she was sending wages back to Kenya to support her family. What this forced her to do, basically, to provide healthcare and education for her family in Kenya, because obviously there's not the same welfare state in Kenya as there is here, was to work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Yeah. So really, I mean, all I wanted to say was that this immigration system, of even for the so-called successful migrants, we might say, has actually been, is really about benefiting the private sector, benefiting the capitalist state, and providing a cheap workforce. And that's what I wanted to say.
How's it going? My name's Joseph. I'm from Ireland, and I know I heard a lot of people talking about Ireland here and what anti-Irish immigration. I'm half Pakistani myself. My mother and father met here in England and moved to Ireland then. And what's happening in Ireland at the moment is actually, from listening to what's happening, is actually a lot worse. What's been happening to asylum seekers? Most asylum seekers are expected to live off €19 a week. So that's about, here I think that's £15, I think, or less than that. They're housed in detention centres. Pretty much all of them are housed there, unless you can claim that you have some sort of disability, and then you're put into a house. And again, it's all direct provision. That's what's known as direct provision, where you have to live, they want you to live off the government. What's happened in a lot of these centres where they're housed is that the standards of living is disgusting. The plates in the restaurant, in let's say the canteens, dogs lick them. The security guards are racist. I've intervened in a number of security guards who look after these centres, where they will call the majority of the immigrants in Ireland who are in these centres are Nigerians. That's the biggest immigrant population in Ireland who are asylum seekers, and the security guards will call them monkeys on the street. You'll see it out and out. Then the taxi, for instance, the taxi sector in Ireland, the Nigerians have come over and they've, thank God, they've been able to get work there. Those are refugees and not asylum seekers. They're working there, but again, daily basis. I'm from Galway in the west of Ireland. Students now. Students will beat up and racially abuse taxi drivers on a daily basis. And this is from talking. This has been happening over the last 6-7 years. It hasn't stopped. I was speaking to a taxi driver just before I came over to London here just last week. His whole side of his mouth was smashed in. They just accept it now. The Nigerians accept it. And so when we talk about what's been happening, the anti-Irish racism that happened, the Irish are taking it back and they're doing it worse. And we often say to the Irish, how dare you do that? Because you were the ones that during the famine times were able to go over to America, were able to live there. But now look at what you're doing to the immigrants here. And when you talk to immigrants, Talk to, if you know any Nigerians or know any Pakistani or Indian people here in England, talk to them and ask them who they think the most racist country in the world is. And they will all say, I've even spoken to some here at this Marxism Festival, and they've said, it's Ireland. I hate to say it to you, but it's Ireland. Because of the way the Irish are, because during the Celtic Tiger, when times are good, they didn't want these immigrants coming over and taking their piece of the pie. And now that times are bad, in a concept that I like to call horizontal blame, where they blame those people who are directly beside them rather than those who are above them, they will attack them straight away. And we're seeing things like that, such as another thing in Ireland, you can't go to university if you're an asylum seeker, unless you can change your religion to Roman Catholicism and get the Catholic Church to pay for you, and the fees then is the same as normal for here. It's about 9,000 to about 12,000 euros. So don't get any illusions of grandeur about Ireland. It's a lot worse than here. And the first thing that needs to be done is stop deportations. Deportations are happening on a daily basis in Ireland. They still happen every day. They go to parties where Nigerians go, they round up people, ask them for their GNIB cards, which is the Garda or Police National Immigration Bureau cards. If they don't have them, they'll take you and they'll deport you straight away, without any saying anything to anybody, not saying to the rest of your family. That's what's happening in Ireland. I just thought I'd like to inform you about that.
It's actually a book of essays, a brilliant selection of essays from different people from different parts of the labour movement. It's a smashing book together. I would just ask you, this is the very final little bundle of 20,000 that we've given out now. We're about to go to a reprint. It's supported nationally by the NUJ, UCU and the Quakers. We're hoping to go quite soon with a proper press launch. You'll get a reply from Theresa May actually, and it's a load of crap, and we are actually lies amongst other things, and we're getting a legal opinion which is going to be quite soon given out so that people know when they get the reply what the actual answers are. So I would ask you to send this to Theresa May. If you want more copies, because we're going to go for a reprint, come and leave your name and your contact details and we will get you the PDF and get you some. Just to say, I agree actually with Martin Smith, what Martin Smith said at the rally last night. These people can be beaten. They have to be beaten, but they can be beaten because there are more of them than there are more of us than there are of them. And we are the people that produce everything that's worthwhile in this world. And all we need to do is stick together, stand up, fight together. Fight them, get rid of the system, and that is, you know, that will be it. We'll get rid of the Nazis, we will get rid of all the vicious economic horrors that actually visit all the working class. We just need to stand together and fight together, and we will win.
I think some of the contributions here have been incredibly uplifting, and I think it's something which we should be extremely proud of as socialists, is the work that my organisation, the Socialist Workers' Party, and others, but I have to say my organisation in particular is doing up and down the country, because we've seen just snippets of the work that we've done. And you know, the first time I ever run across Socialist Worker was in 1976, when at that time there were a number of Asian people being driven out of Malawi, forced to come to Britain, sent to Britain, and the press ran the most incredible, vicious, racist campaign against those people. And I remember as a young lad, and I was very young in 1976 actually, I remember seeing the headlines in the Sun and the Mirror and all the garbage that was being poured out, and I remember feeling how awful it was, and knowing that a lot of the comments were being directed against people like me. You know, despite the fact that I was born in Britain. And I do remember seeing people selling Socialist Worker on Monument Bridge in Hull. And I didn't buy a copy, much to my shame, but I remember to this day what the headline was. And the headline was, "They're welcome here." And I thought, fantastic. There was somebody there. I wish I bought the paper, actually, at the time. I bought it not long afterwards, but I think the work that we were doing then and the work we're doing now is so vitally important. Because people sometimes say, yeah, revolutionaries, what difference do you make? I'll tell you what difference we make. We make a difference to the lives of those people who actually come to us, who we work with, who we win cases for. We make a difference to their lives. And if we ensure that one asylum seeker, one refugee is not deported, then that makes everything we do worthwhile. Absolutely it does. And this sort of thing, you know, about working class people who are inherently racist and so on, I don't believe that for 1 second. I don't believe it. What Margaret talked about in Glasgow, how people will come out, we know that that's not an isolated example. There are lots of other examples. And I'll tell you where those examples come from. They come from when ordinary people stand and work with and live with refugees and asylum seekers. And those divisions and those lies that are poured out from the media suddenly begin to evaporate and they realise they're just like them. There's been some fantastic campaigns in which we haven't been involved in at all, but which have been run by ordinary people saying, you're not going to deport that family. We know them. They're just like us. And that gives us immense hope. And you see the other thing as well. You know, Britain. Britain is a country of migrants. There isn't a single person in this room, I can tell you now, unless you're a pick. Is there any picks in this room? No, I didn't think there was. There's none of us, not one of us, who somewhere along the line isn't a product of immigration and migrants. And around the world, when you go around the world, I mean, I mentioned it before about the expats. You go to any town or city, anywhere in the country, and you'll find a Geordie, a Scouser, somebody from Scotland. Why? Because people move from this country to find a better life elsewhere. And I remember an apocryphal tale where a British politician was talking to a politician from India, saying, do you ever think of taking your people back? He said, yeah, I think we'll take our people back. When you take your people back from New Zealand, from Canada, from America, and all the way around the world. But that's not our approach. Our approach is, this is our world. This is our world. And you know, when you hear Miliband going on about scarcity of resources, that cheeky bastard, he's the one who tells us we're going to have to cut things. We didn't create the scarcity. There's no scarcity for bankers, is there? And I tell you what, they're going to think about deporting anybody. I can think of a few bankers I'd like to put on a boat and send into the bloody Atlantic. We'll start with Bob Diamond. The fact is that we are now being assaulted. We're having a wave of racism. And that racism is designed specifically to come at a time when people are angry about the conditions that we face. You know, when Marx wrote that the ruling class are conscious of it. Oh yes, they are. But they're conscious of this. They have to play the race card. It doesn't come automatically. I'll tell you what comes automatically, the sense of unity. When you're working alongside somebody, I used to be a branch secretary of Yunus and a health worker, a nurse, and I used to go into the nursing homes and recruit people into the union, the Filipino nurses, and the sense of unity you had in those workplaces where people stood together is the antidote to the poison of racism. And you know, when they talk about scarcity of resources and housing and pressure, we have to say this. I'll tell you what, let's be a bit radical. I'm not great with economics, but I'll tell you this. Where we have people without houses, where we have building workers on the dole, where you have stockpiles of bricks, here's a thought. Why don't we use the workers, use the bricks, build the houses and give people houses? Simple. It's called socialism. It's called common bloody sense. Straightforward. Or second thing, why don't we take off some of these bastards' second and third houses? I'll tell you what, you can house every single homeless person in London in one house. It's called Buckingham Palace. Every single one, why not? You know, I mean, again, this stuff about, restricting people from Spain and Greece moving. Yeah, that's great. That's a good idea, isn't it? Why don't they start restricting the capital that's flowing out of Greece and out of Spain into the banks? Why don't they start with that? Until the day comes when capital is restricted, human beings shouldn't be restricted either, because they create the wealth. It's all right for the bosses to move their wealth around the world when they want, but when workers who create that wealth want to move with it, oh no, you can't go. You're going to be a burden. No, our class isn't a burden. Their class is a burden on us. That's how we've got to see it. And then just lastly, you know, people say, you know, USWP, you're against all immigration controls. You're against all borders. What What would happen if we didn't have borders? People would be flooded into Britain. You ever been to Hartlepool? I know there's one fellow sitting there. I'll tell you what, if we had a world without borders, do you think anybody in their right bloody mind is going to say, I tell you what, I'm off to Hartlepool tomorrow? Absolutely not. I'll tell you what would happen. The people of bloody Hartlepool would say, we're off. We're going. We're going to Bermuda. That's where I'm going into. I think perhaps the people of Bermuda might be a bit worried about that, or the Maldives and so on. But we want a world where there are no borders. We don't need to have a little piece of paper to prove who you are. You are who you say you are. That's what we want. We want a world without wars, without famine, which is created by this system. We want a world where people can enjoy this planet. We don't see enough of it. My grandmother was 94 when she died. She lived all her life in Hull. The furthest she ever went to in entire life was Manchester for a day. Right? I tell you what, the ruling class don't do that, do they? They're everywhere. They're here, they're there, they enjoy this world, they enjoy the planet, they suck it dry of resources, they want to destroy it at the same time, but they also want to enjoy it while they can. Why shouldn't our people enjoy that? We want a world without borders, where there are no countries, where there are no citizens, where we're just people, where we're just human beings, where we can enjoy the fruits of this world. That's what we want. Right? For the people of Hartlepool and the rest, we want that. And the only way we're going to get it is to destroy the lunatics who control this world. They create the famines, they create the wars, they create the scarcities, and they create the divisions that divide us and stop us fighting as one against them. This is a tremendous meeting, because every time we stand up and stand alongside somebody who's been persecuted, we are standing in the great tradition of our class. And our class's tradition is that unity is strength. Our strength comes from us standing together, shoulder to shoulder. The oppressed against the oppressors. That's our position, and that's why I say the position of the Socialist Workers' Party is and always will be. You're welcome here, you're our brothers and sisters.